In chapter 6, we are going to learn how plants and other organisms, but mainly focusing on plants, are able to use sunlight energy to get food. So an overall view of photosynthesis, which is that process. So ultimately, all energy comes from the sun in some form or another. We can stand in the sun all day long. We are not going to get any energy from that. So we rely on organisms like plants, algae, and some bacteria to go through this process of photosynthesis that is able to capture that sunlight energy and use it to make food. Interestingly enough, of all the energy coming from the sun, only about 1% of it is actually used for photosynthesis. Now, in plants, which is, again, where we're going to focus for this course, photosynthesis takes place in chloroplasts. So this is one of the organelles found in plant cells. And inside the chloroplast, which is what is shown up here, there are actually three kind of different layers. So chloroplasts have an outer membrane, obviously on the outside. Right inside of that outer membrane is what's called the inner membrane. So you see kind of this layering effect here to show these two layers right beside each other. And then there's a third membrane called the thylakoid membrane. And this membrane forms these individual little discs. And each disc is called a thylakoid. So the thylakoid membrane makes up thylakoids. And then these stack together, so you see these multiple stacks, kind of like pancakes. Each one is called a granum, or plural is grana. So those that are stacking together form the grana. And then the fluid all the way inside here, so it's not just empty space, there's fluid, just like the cytoplasm of the cell. The fluid inside is called the stroma. So again, we have our thylakoids of that thylakoid internal membrane. Stacks of those are called grana. Again, the stroma is the fluid inside. Another important part to being able to go through photosynthesis for plants are what are called photosystems. And these are embedded in those thylakoid membranes, and these contain the pigments. And the pigments, the main one that plants use is called chlorophyll, and this is what gives that green color. Now, the reason they're so important is because they act like antennas that capture the energy from the sun. Again, this is what separates us. We don't have pigment, or we don't have chlorophyll pigments, so we can't absorb that energy from the sun in order to do anything with it. All right, so photosynthesis, kind of an overview. First of all, there are three stages in which it occurs, and they're labeled in the figure below. So the first stage shown down here is capturing that sunlight energy. So capturing that energy from the sun, and that's using these photosystems. And we'll get into each of these in more detail in a minute. But that first stage is capturing the energy using those pigments that are clustered in areas called photosystems. Now, once that energy is captured, it is used to make two main products: ATP, energy we've talked about before with respiration, and NADPH. So if you remember way back to aerobic respiration and going through metabolism and fermentation to get energy, electron carriers, we talked about NADH, but this very similar NADPH, so you can think P for photosynthesis, it's an electron carrier. So just like NADH and FADH2 that we talked about carry electrons, in photosynthesis, NADPH is carrying the electrons. So we're getting some energy and some electrons from that light. Those take place in what's called the light-dependent reaction, so the production of ATP and NADPH. So those are the two main products here, but again, we need that sunlight for that to happen. Then using that ATP and NADPH in the third step, in addition to adding some carbon dioxide, the Calvin cycle, or the light-deep independent reactions, are making the ultimate product, kind of the important product here. The main show is making glucose, or making carbohydrates. So again, using that energy and those electrons from ATP and NADPH, the carbohydrates like glucose are made. Again, we also need carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for that as well. So the reaction for photosynthesis can be summarized here. So at the top, these are our reactants. So we need carbon dioxide, we need water, we'll talk about why, and of course we need light in order for that to happen. So that's on the left of this arrow here. So just a little chemistry, everything on the left, that's what we need to get started. In this case, it's on the top. And everything on the right are the products. So this molecule here, C6H12O6, that is what glucose is. It's just the chemical formula for it. So glucose is made, again, that's the main goal, is to make those carbohydrates. We also get some water being made, so it's a reactant and a product. And instead of carbon dioxide, on this side, we have oxygen. So carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen gets released. But again, the main goal here is to make that glucose. So going into these a bit more, so the light dependent and independent reactions, again, just kind of overviewing them first. So the light dependent reaction, so those first two steps, again, as the name implies, we need light for that to happen. So that light energy is captured and it's used to make NADPH and ATP. So energy and electrons, and that occurs at those thylakoid membranes. Now that's followed by the light independent reaction. It's also called the Calvin cycle. So you'll hear those used interchangeably. In direct applications, it does not need light. Now, again, it had to have had light at some point, so it's more indirect though. And that's the point where that energy from ATP and NADPH is used to make those organic molecules, again, glucose. And this happens at the stroma, so the fluid inside the chloroplast, that's where those reactions occur. All right, so stepping back just a little bit, talking about the energy coming in from the sun. So first of all, understanding that light comes to the earth in little packets of energy called photons. So these are little packets of energy called photons. And that sunlight has varying energy levels. And that's what we can see here. This is called our electromagnetic spectrum. Here, this is all the energy coming from the sun. So again, electromagnetic spectrum. So we have things like gamma rays, we have radio waves, visible light, X-rays. All of that is the energy coming from the sun. Now, it travels in waves that are seen up here. So these waves coming in, as you see, they start spreading apart. So as the wavelengths, the distance between the top of a wave and the top of the next wave, as that gets longer, the energy is decreasing. So these that are really, really close together, these have a lot of energy. These at the other end have less energy to them. So again, this energy coming from the sun isn't all equal. So these little packets of energy, some have a lot of energy, some have less energy, and that's based on their wavelength that they are approaching us. Now, again, for photosynthesis, pigments like the chlorophyll, that is what's actually absorbing that light energy. So the pigment in our eyes, they absorb this visible light spectrum. And this is actually also what's used for photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is using this visible light spectrum. That's why only about 1% of all the energy coming from the sun is used for that, because that's what can be harvested and absorbed by those pigments. So just a little bit more about how that happens. So the main pigments is chlorophyll, as we mentioned. There are two different types, A and B, but then there are lots of other pigments that are out there, and they're called accessory pigments. Because as this, what's called an absorption spectrum here to the right is showing, is that a single pigment cannot absorb all of that visible light spectrum. Okay, so this is again the distance between two waves, the wavelength. So what we can see here is with chlorophyll A, which is our solid line, where the peaks are, these are the wavelengths that are absorbed by that pigment. So chlorophyll A can absorb down here in the blue light from about 400 to 450. And then you see another peak down here in the reds and oranges. So it also peaks down here, so around 650 to 700. And then chlorophyll B, a little bit different. So it can absorb up into almost 500. And then again, another little peak around like 625 or so, and then overlaps with chlorophyll A. So if these chlorophylls were all the pigments that a plant had, it can still definitely absorb the blue and the red light, but it would be missing out on all of this light in between. So the accessory pigments, like carotenoids, for an example, and this is just one, it absorbs additional wavelengths. So if we combine chlorophyll A and B, and now we add in some carotenoid, we just gained an extra bit of energy here that can be used for photosynthesis. And again, there are many, many other pigments. And in the fall, as chlorophyll A stops being produced, that's why you start seeing all these other colors, because pigments appear the color that they reflect. So again, chlorophyll is green because, as you can see, it doesn't absorb it. It reflects the green light. So that's the color that we see. Anything being absorbed, you wouldn't be able to see it. All right, so moving into a little bit more about our light-dependent reactions, so that those photons, again, the visible light, travels in, they get absorbed by these chlorophylls. So the green little dots here, these are the chlorophyll pigments embedded in this big group called a photosystem. So these pigments come in, they absorb this energy from the sun, and essentially you kind of have this ping pong effect bouncing from one to another until it ultimately reaches what's called the reaction center. So this reaction center of this photosynthesis, excuse me, of this photosystem, whenever that energy gets to this reaction center, it's going to pop off an electron. Now that electron shown here is this little negative E because electrons are negatively charged. So an electron falls off. Now the electron can't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. So there's an electron acceptor. So we'll talk about what the options are for that here in a minute. But then ultimately the pigments can't keep losing electrons. They also need something to donate them, to replace those electrons. So as an electron pops off, another electron is coming in from another source. And we'll see here in a little bit that source for plants is actually water. That's the electron donor. And then depending on the photosystem, the acceptor can be a little bit different. All right, so in the light-dependent reactions, in order to make ATP, one of those excited electrons from those photosystems that was lost, so remember something has to accept that electron that came off the chlorophyll, so that excited electron actually moves along molecules in that thylakoid membrane. And the energy from that excited electron is pumping or moving hydrogen ions, also called protons, across the membrane. Then what's unique, if you remember this back from respiration, then those hydrogen ions come back into the membrane through special channels called ATP synthase, and that energy is ultimately used to make ATP. So again, hopefully this is bringing back a little bit of memory of aerobic respiration, where in the mitochondria, electrons coming from NADH and FADH2 enter those electron transports, they move the protons, and ultimately ATP gets made. Same idea here in photosynthesis. It's just the energy from the electrons is coming from the sun. All right, now again, that electron has to, from the electron transport chain, it has to leave and go somewhere else. We can't just have random electrons hanging out in the world. So it actually gets accepted by another photosystem. So again, we have electron donors and electron acceptors. So for some photosystems, it's the electrons lost from another photosystem that come back. They get re-energized whenever more photons are absorbed. Now this time, instead of the electron going to an electron transport, as it moves through that second electron transport, no ATP is going to be made. Instead, we're going to get the production of NADPH. So electrons coming off some photosystems make ATP, those coming off others make NADPH. All right, so showing these two, so in plants, there's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Unfortunately, they were named based on how they were discovered. So 1 was discovered before 2, but whenever we're talking about photosynthesis, we actually start with photosystem 2. So a little bit confusing there. Sorry about that. But we're going to start here at photosystem 2. So this group of chlorophyll molecules in photosystem 2, again, the photons coming in, that energy gets passed into that reaction center. That excited reaction center dumps off an electron. So now we have an excited electron. It has a lot more energy, and it's going to enter into electron transport. Now, energy from that electron gets used to move hydrogen ions, and it sets up a proton gradient. Then those protons go back through the membrane, and that energy is used to make ATP. Now, this electron here at the end of the electron transport, it's coming back into the photosystem 1. Again, unfortunately, we're going backwards. Just with the order, they were numbered based on their order of discovery, not necessarily the order in which they work. So the electron from photosystem 2 goes to photosystem 1. Then as more photons, as you see here, as more photons get absorbed by these chlorophyll molecules, again, that energy comes into this reaction center, and now it dumps off an electron. Again, now we're in a high excited state. It enters one of those electron transport systems, but instead of making ATP like we'd seen before and moving hydrogen ions, instead that electron is given to NADP and is used to make NADPH. So electrons from photosystem 1 make NADPH. Electrons from photosystem 2 are going to be used to make ATP. So again, those electrons are going to different places based on the photosystem. Now, just to come back to where replacing those electrons, let me get rid of some of this. So those electrons, again, in photosystem 2 that were released, they need to be replaced. So we need a donor. And that's the job here of water. So water is going to be broken down. Its sole purpose of breaking down water in photosynthesis is to replace those electrons. So photosystem 2 has a continuous supply of electrons as long as water is being broken down. Now, as a byproduct, it produces oxygen, and that's why oxygen gets made during photosynthesis. Water is broken down to release electrons, oxygen diffuses away, the electrons provide continuous supplies for photosystem 2, then those electrons provide a continuous supply to photosystem 1. All right, so photosystem 2 gets electrons from water, photosystem 1 gets electrons from photosystem 2. So we have a donor for those electrons, and then once they come off, those electron transport systems are the acceptors. Now again, just a little bit more to kind of put it here in words too, in case you didn't keep up with all of that. So these light-dependent reactions, again, it's non-cyclic photophosphorylation. Because again, those electrons are not going in a cycle, they're moving from one photosystem to another, so it's non-cyclic. We're using energy from photons to phosphorylate or make ATP. All right, so again, photosystem 2 captures those photons. They release those to electron transport chains that ultimately produce ATP. Photosystem 1, on the other hand, again, it absorbs photons of light, release those to those electron transport, but they're going to use those electrons to make NADPH instead of ATP. So a little bit about more about the photosystem 2. Again, its reaction center has multiple proteins in there, but essentially it acts as an antenna complex. Again, it's absorbing all of those photons. That's its job, is to absorb the photons and transfer that energy to the reaction center. So then once that reaction center is activated, an excited electron comes off, and again, it has to go somewhere. So that acceptor then receives those electrons, but again, now we need something to replace them, and that's the job of water. So water is split, that replaces the electrons for photosystem 2's reaction center, but again, it also produces that oxygen as a byproduct. All right, now these electron transport systems, very similar to what we had talked about with mitochondria and aerobic respiration. So they're going to receive those electrons from photosystem 2, and that those electron transports have different proteins. They just pass the electron from one to the other, and those are found on that thylakoid membrane. Now, some of those proteins that are in the transport chain are proton pumps. So they're going to use the energy from that electron that was just dumped off to move protons or hydrogen ions, same thing, from the stroma, the fluid inside of the clot in the cytoplasm, into some of those little thylakoids, those little pancakes. It's moving the protons into that space, and then they come back, and through that process of moving protons in and out, it releases energy that makes ATP. And again, at the end of that electron transport chain, those electrons have to go somewhere. So those electrons are passed to photosystem 1. And just like with aerobic respiration, this process of making ATP by moving protons around is called chemiosmosis. So these proton pumps and electron transport, again, that membrane of the thylakoid is impermeable to protons. So the only way to re-enter the stroma, so again, the electron transport pumped them into the thylakoid, the only way to get back out into the stroma where they really want to be is through a transport protein called ATP synthase. And as the name implies, it makes ATP. So it provides a passage for the protons, and in the process, it reproduces that ATP. So as the protons diffuse back down their gradient, ATP synthase uses that energy to make ATP. And this process is called chemiosmosis. Now, photosystem 1 is a little bit different. Again, it still receives electrons, but now instead of coming from water, they're coming from photosystem 1, so from that first electron transport system. Again, its reaction center is also going to release excited electrons after photons are absorbed, but those electrons and the hydrogen ions, instead of making ATP, they're going to be used to make NADPH. Okay, and this is because this removes that proton from the stroma and helps in setting up that proton gradient that allows that first electron transport to set up chemiosmosis. All right, so again, just this process of chemiosmosis. So again, photosystem 2, photons are coming in, they excite the electron, that electron falls off. Again, they need a replacement electron that's provided by water, so it replaces the electrons there. Now, as the electron comes off of here, that moves into an electron transport. This proton pump is going to use energy from this electron to move this hydrogen ion or proton into the thylakoid space. So again, here's the stroma, that's the fluid inside the cytoplasm. And then in those little pancakes, that thylakoid space. So it's pumping, it's using energy to move protons from a low concentration to a high concentration. So it needs energy. That energy comes from the electron. So now we have all of these hydrogen ions hanging out, and now they really want to get back in to the stroma. So we'll come back to that here in just a second. But if we just keep an eye on this electron, now the electron at the end of that electron transport, it's going over here to photosystem 1. And now as photons come into photosystem 1, those electrons come off. Again, they're replaced by those from photosystem 2. Those electrons come off, enter that electron transport, but instead of making ATP, it's going to make NADPH. Okay, so again, if we just kind of look at, I'm going to get rid of all of this. Okay, so if we just look kind of one more time at the flow of these electrons. Okay, so first of all, electrons are provided by water to photosystem 2. That's where the electrons are coming from. Then as photons come in, those electrons fall off of photosystem 2. They move into an electron transport chain. That energy is used to move protons. Once the electron gets to the end of the transport chain, it's going over to photosystem 1. Then as photons are absorbed by photosystem 1, that electron comes off and it's picked up by NADP, ultimately to make NADPH. So that electron is stored finally, kind of terminally, in NADPH. Now it's going to donate it later, But as far as the light-dependent reactions, that electron is carried away by this NADPH. So it's provided by water, goes away with NADPH. Now, looking back to that first electron transport, so again, as the electron falls off of photosystem 2 and enters the electron transport, again, these protons are pumped in. They're going from a low to high concentration, so it needs energy. That energy comes from the electron, which ultimately came from the sun. So that energy is pumping those protons in to this thylakoid space, so inside the little pancakes. Now, these protons, these hydrogen ions, really want to go back to the stroma. They're want to go from a high to low concentration. They're charged, so they cannot get through this membrane. So they need a transport protein to get back. And that is the job of ATP synthase. So those hydrogen ions go back into the stroma through ATP synthase. And as they go from a high to low concentration, that energy is used to make ATP. All right, so now as we move into the light independent reactions, we're getting into the Calvin cycle. So now all of that ATP and NADPH that were made before, we're going to use that energy to make those organic molecules. Now these reactions are known as C3 photosynthesis. There are some other types as well, but that's what we're focusing on here. Now, in order for one glucose molecule to be made, the Calvin cycle has to go through the exact same reaction 6 times. So remember, our chemical formula for glucose was C6H12O6. Okay, so we need 6 carbons added. So it takes 6 turns of this Calvin cycle to get 6 carbons to make one glucose molecule. Again, in order to do that, we need carbon here, and that comes from that carbon dioxide. So that carbon is coming from that carbon dioxide. It needs energy to make anything. So ATP is going to drive the cycle, and NADPH that we just made as well is going to provide hydrogen atoms to put that molecule together. All right, so now in the light independent reactions, again, also called the Calvin cycle, we have 3 main parts of this cycle. So it starts with what's called carbon fixation. This is where carbon from carbon dioxide is coming in. It is added to a molecule already here called RUBP. So the addition of the carbon from carbon dioxide to this molecule of RUBP, it kind of adds that carbon, and then it splits into 2 molecules of 3-phosphoglycerate. Again, I'm not concerned that you remember that name. It's kind of a long name. But again, just knowing that carbon from carbon dioxide is added to this RUBP molecule that was already there, it makes a molecule called 3-phosphoglycerate. Then through the production of organic molecules, or the sugar, energy from ATP, hydrogens, and energy from NADPH are used to make another molecule called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And ultimately, that molecule is converted into glucose and other carbohydrates. Okay, but first, we need the carbon from carbon dioxide. We need energy from ATP and electrons and hydrogens from NADPH. So through those 2 processes, carbon fixation and the production of sugar, we get our carbohydrate, we get our glucose. Now, this is a cycle. If you remember back to the Krebs cycle we talked about in respiration, and any type of cycle, that means that one of the molecules we started with gets remade during the reactions. So the last part of the Calvin cycle is reforming that RUBP that we started with here at the beginning. So during the last steps, the remaining molecules that are left over, again, I'm not concerned that you remember all of these kind of crazy names, but ultimately more energy, again, from ATP is used to convert this molecule left over after glucose was made back to one of the molecules we started with, back to RUBP. So we don't have to add in RUBP, it was already there. and it's there because it gets remade by the end of each Calvin cycle. So it's not constantly supplied or depleted. It's just kind of temporarily used and then it's replaced.